Hello, I'm Tom Plant, Director of Proliferation and Nuclear Policy here at RUSI, and I'm here with Cristina Varriale, who is a research analyst in the Proliferation and Nuclear Policy team. And we're going to be talking today a little bit about the summit between President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So pretty interesting stuff, I guess, overnight. We've been looking at the fairly long and rambling press conference from President Trump and the fairly light on detail summit declaration that they both appear to have signed. Now, we've been poring over that for detail and struggling really to find any. I think that would be fair to say, wouldn't it? I mean, where have you been focusing?
I agree. I think your use of interesting at the beginning of that opening there was in itself interesting. Because I think for me the statement or the letter that both Kim and Trump signed was relatively light on substance. We haven't necessarily seen much by the way of a concrete plan going forward, other than points that they hope to talk about in the future. That said, the press conference that, as you highlighted by Trump, was much more interesting. Mm-hmm. Topics came up that hadn't previously been acknowledged to have been discussed with Kim. For example, the troops in South Korea and the joint military exercises. Yeah. It appears that he's unilaterally paused those exercises.
Well, who knows, right? I mean, there's a lot to go into and unpack, isn't there? So why don't we start with the declaration as it's written down, which, as you say, doesn't have a vast amount in there. And some of this is interesting in the genuine sense, and some of it's interesting in a sort of yes, minister, what an interesting idea sense, isn't it? So let's say we've got this commitment to establish good relations, that sort of thing. That's the first line, isn't it? Which feels a bit like this move that the North Koreans have always wanted towards sort of normalised relations, isn't it? This kind of establishing diplomatic relations. I mean, how far and how fast do you think that will be going?
Time will tell. I think the fact that this summit occurred in the first place is a big step in that direction. Because Trump is going to be seeing this as a win, in the press conference, most journalists who answered his question, or he took questions from, they congratulated him first. And that's going to really play to his ego. He's going to really want to make sure that this process of engagement carries on. He's not going to let it die. And
they nodded as well, I think, to at least 2 more meetings. I think to call them planned would be a bit too strong, wouldn't it? I mean, there was this sense that Trump had invited Kim to Washington, to the White House, and that Trump would be willing to go to Pyongyang. But he said it was kind of the appropriate time or something like that, didn't he? It wasn't.
Yeah, so it's definitely not a formal invitation yet, as far as I understood. It was more that he would be happy to host him. He allowed him to stick his head inside of his official car when he was in Singapore. So it's who knows what he's going to let him see in the White House. But it's definitely a positive sign that engagement will continue. I think it's more likely, and almost certainly going to continue at the lower levels, hopefully in an ongoing process rather than just spits and spurts of meetings here and there. And maybe this whole unconventional administration and the whole unconventional process that we've seen so far does open up the opportunity for something a little bit different with North Korea this time. I mean, that prospect of those follow-on summit meetings, if you like, in DC and Pyongyang, I mean, the thought of a US president going to Pyongyang when the denuclearization issue isn't substantively resolved is, to me, a little bit concerning, because it feels like a huge carrot. That feels like a big dangle. So I think it's kind of right to even, I feel it's a little bit unjustified. We were talking about this in the office before we came over, weren't we? We're kind of used to sort of, particularly over the Iran deal, pointing at the Trump administration's policy and sort of going, this is terrible, this stuff is falling apart, you don't understand what you're doing. And I think to some extent, in this case, we've got to be a little bit careful of mental bleed across, haven't we? This kind of idea that let's assess this on its merits. Maybe they shouldn't have been here in these circumstances at all in the first place, with the Trump's military threats last year and all that sort of stuff. But given we are where we are, how does the outcome sort of rate? Well, not actually terrible. I think we have to see what happens as a result of action. But anyway, you talked about lower level follow-on, and that is also a component of the declaration, isn't it? We've got Mike Pompeo specifically named in the agreement that it's signed as, being tasked with implementing negotiations, and an unnamed high-level North Korean official. I mean, they haven't appointed one yet, so I wonder if this came as a surprise or if they just haven't named that person. So it sounds like the process that you're laying out is indeed the way that they're going to go. I think it's a matter of making sure that actually gets sustained as well. And making sure that, as I mentioned before, this is a win for Trump, or he sees it as a win for himself, and making sure that he doesn't feel like that's enough. He's done it. He's trumped Obama.
maybe part of the fun.
Yeah.
But making sure that actually this is something that does produce something much more substantive. And I agree with your point on Trump going to Pyongyang. Hopefully that will be a carrot that he dangles but holds back until there is something more concrete on paper.
Let's hope those cards are played at the right time for the right value.
Absolutely. And I think the issue or the risk that we're facing with that aspect of things is that it's going to be really difficult to make sure that the maximum pressure campaign and sanctions implementation is rigorous and is sustained at a high level.
Yeah.
It's already been one of those issues that's been quite challenging to make sure that there is implementation at a level sufficient to really pinch the North Koreans. And this whole showmanship of the summit and this almost reconciliation between Trump and Kim absolutely risks that. We've already seen the Malaysians make a statement they're going to potentially be reopening their embassy in Pyongyang.
Absolutely crazy. I mean, considering where we were, with Kim Jong-un's brother, Kim Jong-nam, being murdered in Malaysia, the police investigation and so forth. I mean, is this what it takes for normalization? Is this what it takes to get over the line with the Malaysians? I find that baffling.
I think it's also interesting that, is this what it takes? Applying that to the North Koreans as well, is acquiring a nuclear capability what it takes to be recognised by the US? And although it's one of those questions that we can all smirk at and kind of put aside as a bigger question, longer term picture thing, it's absolutely something that might be on the minds of other nations. And I'm by no means suggesting that we're going to now see a world of proliferators because they all want recognition. But I think in the broader non-proliferation strategy, it's absolutely something we need to be mindful of.
Yeah, and to some extent, I mean, there's two things here, isn't it? One of it was kind of North Korea's strategy. They almost call it the India strategy, don't they? When you get your nuclear weapons, the US will be forced to deal with us. North Korea is a great, powerful nation. They'll have no choice, and they'll treat us as they treat the Indians, valued trading partner. And then sort of on the other side, I guess you've got this sense, as you're talking about the damage to the wider non-proliferation regime, I think it's too soon to say whether that will be an issue. I think you're right to highlight the kind of end scenario where that happens as problematic, because, I mean, if we look at say, again, to take the example of the Iranian nuclear program, I mean, the talk around that was if this wasn't restrained, if a deal wasn't reached, it would lead to a cascade of proliferation in the Middle East. I mean, I lost count of the number of times I've heard that phrase. And people have made similar arguments about Northeast Asia, but well, here we are. Here we are. So we'll be testing that, I guess. But you raise a good point around the maximum pressure campaign and leverage in general. I mean, I think you're pointing at the fact that, maybe this is going to be harder to sustain now. I think there's also a fundamental thing, isn't there, which is how strong was maximum pressure in the first place if all the US could get out of North Korea at this meeting, when the North Koreans were allegedly, crawling towards the table? Was this fairly vague commitment? I mean, they've really bought not that much. Does it tell us that maximum pressure is really not that strong after all? It's what it seems like to me.
I agree, and I don't think we can entirely give credit to the Trump regime for that. I think we also need to look at what was happening in North Korea itself. We've probably got to a stage now where they've tested an ICBM, they've tested what we're assuming is a two-stage thermonuclear device. I think it's safe to make the assumption that they're probably relatively content with the capabilities they've been able to develop, and therefore now feel they have the space to turn to a different direction for maybe even a short period of time. But I think it would be a mistake to not look at that side of things as well. So although the maximum pressure campaign might have played a part in that, but I think it's more likely to have played a part in forcing North Korea to ramp up their testing schedule throughout 2017 to make sure they achieved that capability before military action became much higher up the agenda in the White House than it already was. To then be able to scale things back again with a capability they felt comfortable with.
I mean, that's the New Year's statement, isn't there, from Kim Jong-un, where he basically, I mean, we're very much on track with what he said he was going to do, pretty much. I mean, we have the issue of, we've done, basically, I'm going to paraphrase here, right, because who can remember all of that? Well, somebody out there can, I'm sure, but I can't. We've basically done all the testing we need to do. The main thing to do now is to develop and expand the state nuclear forces, mass production of missiles and nuclear weapons. And all of the infrastructure that has been talked about at the moment, the Punggye nuclear test site, which has not been destroyed, as some people say, but merely had the entrance of 3 of its tunnels and some empty wooden buildings blown up, really not that impressive, is not actually that important for that mass production side of things. In fact, it's not important at all. And the thing we heard today from Donald Trump, where he said, in addition to, as you said, what was in the declaration,
they'll be destroying a missile test site. Well, I mean, that's a positive thing, I guess, but also, do they need that? And B, how many others do they have? They certainly don't necessarily need it for mass production. So it's basically in line with that statement. So now we'll see Kim Jong-un presumably focus on the economy. Use this to validate his policy from the New Year statement, right?
Absolutely, but again, that shouldn't be necessarily a surprise. It's interesting the time scale it comes, but it's interesting in terms of the policy he set out at the beginning of his leadership. He always mentioned that he wanted to pursue a two-track policy of making sure that the nuclear program was growing sufficiently to develop the capability that North Korea desired, but also making sure that the economy develops sufficiently as well. And we've seen the first 5-6 years of his ruling be focused on the nuclear, and now it's probably time for him to make sure he's pursuing both lines of his two-track policy.
Yeah, and then some scholars would have said that policy has existed for quite some time, and also that now there's a move just towards the economy. I don't know, to be honest with you. I think that North Korea's calculating, the North Korean leadership is calculating its security environment, and to the extent that sanctions have any effect, surely it's in terms of when they create a security pressure, because this is what they would set the nuclear weapons and missiles off against. So I'm just really struggling with the idea that security pressure has existed. I can imagine that North Korea would want to use its nuclear program and other things to extract concessions, to loosen that economic noose around it, because, as you say, it wants to develop. They don't just want to survive, they want to survive to do things, they want to act and to be autonomous. But then there is a sense of how far will they go? Would they sacrifice their security for that? Well, there's clearly no indication that they do.
But I think there is, to some extent as well, the summit process has already loosened that pressure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's mission accomplished, right? Yeah.
There'll be possibly less resistance to trading with North Korea, or less. There might be an inclination to not feel maximum pressure is the top policy right now, and to enforce sanctions fully, like we discussed earlier. Exactly. And that might create enough wiggle room for North Korea to get that extra economic space that they're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth let's dive into the maximum pressure thing a little bit, because obviously there's a lot of work on sanctions that goes on here with our programme, our colleague Emil Dahl and Sarah Pelangeli with the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. And one of the interesting things on the sanctions is really, I mean, Trump had said again in his presser, which was so wide-ranging, it was very, very interesting compared to the summit document, which really wasn't that interesting. He said, I had 3 great, beautiful sanctions or something like 300 ready to go. I assume he means 300 designations or something like that. Well, it's kind of good to say that you have them in the bag, because sanctions threatened are usually better than sanctions sort of put on in sort of, leverage. And there's a reason for that, which is, 40 odd, I think, there's UN Security Council resolutions impose sanctions on North Korea, but enforcement, as you say, is pretty patchy, not just in China, but worldwide. I mean, even the UK's record is not unblemished in that regard. And 40 odd countries don't even submit reports to the UN about their implementation. So it's just this maximum pressure to me is almost more of I salute it as a goal in a way of kind of something you might try and use. But given all those holes in that regime, and that the regime is only as strong as its weakest link, is it really a sensible kind of policy centerpiece? I don't know.
But I think we need to also remember that maximum pressure, although sanctions was a huge part of that, it was also about politically isolating North Korea.
Yeah, true, good point.
We saw Italy, Cuba and others kick out North Korean diplomats last year. And I think that aside from the weakening of sanctions implementation that this summit has caused, it's also massively reduced, if not completely eliminated, any diplomatic pressure on North Korea.
Although would you have said that diplomatic isolation was actually particularly helpful? I mean, I note that the UK, for example, didn't take any action of that nature, quite rightly, I think, actually. But I mean, do you think that that's a particularly valuable thing to be doing, to persuade for the US to persuade its friends and allies to sever their relations, to reduce their diplomatic relations with North Korea?
I think for some of those countries, it might have been the only thing they had in the bag.
Right.
And there has been a lot of arguments that doing something is better than doing nothing. The argument that we see that Obama failed on was strategic patience was essentially sitting back and watching North Korea develop without really doing very much. So I think the maximum pressure campaign was able to put pressure on countries around the world to have some kind of underpinning and an excuse almost to expel those diplomats when things got a bit hairy last year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just not sure it's that useful though, is it? Because this is the thing, it's almost like, it's a circumstance where the US is pressuring its allies to do something in relation to North Korea that isn't really that consequential in terms of policy change by the North Koreans. Do you see what I mean?
I agree. I don't think it was ever going to change the North Korean direction. I don't think it was going to be valuable in that sense. But in terms of rallying the troops behind the US and behind South Korea and behind Japan on this, I think that symbolically at least potentially was able to then support US policy.
Yeah.
There was the well-known, I think it was Nikki Haley made a statement of you're either with us or against us, and although that's up for debate in itself, there was possibly a sense that countries were we will begin to step in line here possibly because of the high risks of military action that the US were also throwing around last year as well. So I agree. I don't necessarily think that diplomatic isolation would have by any means changed the North Korean direction. But I think in terms of the international community writ large feeling as though there was a policy line that could be pursued and a line that they all felt like that they knew what they were doing. And I think that's just as important in itself.
It has the benefit of at least being clear whether or not you agree with it. I mean, so let's just come back to the content of the summit a little bit. So we have this idea that maximum pressure was, it was maximum, that people were, pushing it hard, but really maybe not sufficient to create a security threat. It certainly had quite a lot of holes in it. And the North Koreans, there's numerous cases of sanctions violation, Russian and Chinese actors, but also elsewhere, sort of Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on. So, the North Koreans, there were enough holes in the networks in the sanctions regime for them to be able to apply their trade. And there was a lot of activity going into closing those off, but that was going to be slower than North Korea's nuclear program. And then, as you say, there's the military side of things. Now, this summit, as you originally said, kind of really removes the ground from the maximum pressure approach for those sort of middle ground countries, the ones that the US would have been trying to convince. Look, we know you're not engaged in this directly, but it's very important for non-proliferation regions and so forth that you enforce these sanctions rigorously. They'll now think, maybe, or at least have an argument, that things are going the right way and we don't have to do that. On the other hand as well, we have, is there really any serious prospect of military threat now to North Korea? I mean, I would argue no, not least because Moon Jae-in, presumably right now, is going to be prepping the next approach to Pyongyang. That's got to be the next move, right? Moon reaching out to Kim.
Yes, but I wouldn't say that the military option has completely diminished.
No, really interesting.
I think if this process completely falls apart, and that's not inconceivable.
Totally.
What if North Korea decides to launch a space vehicle? That's something that's not come up, and that's something that has ruined previous engagement with North Korea on a purely definitional basis. Does that then collapse this whole process? We have personalities like John Bolton in the US administration. So I think there is still a way that things could very quickly turn very sour again. And actually maybe even with greater risk, because the US and South Korean alliance maybe wouldn't be on the same page in that circumstance. And there's a huge risk then of splitting the alliance and weakening any deterrent value against North Korea.
So the question would be, whose fault would it have been for crashing it? Would the South Koreans seen it as a US fault, if you see what I mean, or the North? I guess that's a hypothetical in a way, but I think the central point is right, that hopes raised more highly are dashed more thoroughly when they fail. John Bolton, interesting mention there. I mean, clearly, it's shorthand for the collapse of the last substantial negotiated agreement, I guess, with North Korea, the agreed framework. We had the 6-party talks and the Leap Day deal in between there, but the agreed framework was, multi-year, very substantial effort. And of course, it collapsed, shortly after George W. Bush arrived in the White House with John Bolton as, I think, if I remember right, the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control. I'm going to get that wrong. Anyway, a senior position responsible for this sort of thing. And one of the things that was over was undeclared programs, undeclared uranium enrichment program in particular, which the North Koreans never acknowledged until they showed Siegfried Hecker and other academics around their newly installed enrichment plant in 2010. Most people think that there was another one floating around. There must be plenty of other secret or undisclosed facilities in North Korea, right? And
That's got to be a big stumbling block again, hasn't it, with somebody like John Bolton in the mix. And frankly, anybody else who's really looking at what the North Koreans are doing and trying not to be taken for a fool.
Yeah, and I think that just really highlights how complex this is going to be going forward. It's not a matter of looking solely at the missile tests and the nuclear tests and saying, well, they've been stopped, so let's just verify they've been stopped. As you highlight, there are many more layers to the North Korean nuclear program, and it's going to be a tricky process trying to decipher all of those and make sure that they, to the extent that they are wanted to or wish to be included in that process in a negotiated agreement, make sure that they're done so in a way that does increase confidence and trust that North Korea are actually committed to anything that is agreed upon.
Yeah, I mean, there was an interesting snippet, wasn't there, I think in the press conference again. Trump made an allusion to the intelligence that that the US has about North Korea, and said, it's not as good as some countries, presumably he means China, things like that, but that they have some, right? And so there's almost this nod to this idea that, maybe we know some things about you that you don't know that we know. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because that imposes a bit of a risk for the North Koreans. Are they going to be honest or not, knowing that the US might be able to catch them out? Slightly worrying to me, though, that the US president might just blurt that out, though. Do you know what I mean? In the conference, just saying, look, we have some information. Really, please, keep that to yourself.
It's the unconventional nature of the Trump administration.
Yes, swings and roundabouts. You called it a regime earlier, by the way. I thought it was an interesting slip of the tongue.
That was definitely a slip. But absolutely, it's going to be one of those things that's very interesting to watch as we go forward, and making sure that the administration and the North Korean regime are equally committed and as much as they can be equally honest and truthful without leaking anything that shouldn't be leaked. And I think one of the, as a final point, maybe it's worth thinking about reducing media attention to this process going forward to create more space for it to happen.
Well, good luck with that.
To create more space for it to happen successfully without such an eagle eye criticising every move that happens.
I mean, I think, to ask for a reduced media attention is probably on a hiding to nothing, but I think you are onto something with a sense that some of this needs to be kept behind closed doors. I mean, that seems about right, and some of the remarks that we had about the concessions that the North Koreans had reportedly agreed seem to have come out of that kind of process. So lots to watch for here. Clearly, as you set a high bar for success, and it really is, we shouldn't understate how challenging this is. I wouldn't want anybody watching this to be carried away with the enthusiasm that I think we've seen from the world media and crowds in Singapore, shouting, cheering Kim's name in a way that is concerning and unjustified, I think. This is one where we need to be open-minded. I think we just discussing earlier seems like a sensible framing. Realistic as to the likelihood of success, and sort of hoping that this process goes the way that you described, but realising that the probability is quite different. So anyway, so that's it from us here at RUSI. We've had a nice long discussion about the summit and its outcomes there. We'll be looking at this issue much more as it develops in the weeks and months to come, so stay tuned for more of that. From now, it's goodbye from me and goodbye from Christina.